This season, we know the Jets are not Super Bowl contenders, so success or failure is not going to be about whether the team goes all the way. But there are three concrete ways we can judge Aaron Glenn and Darren Mougey in their first year. I'll tell you what they are today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, May 27th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you every dayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Well, on today's show, we're going to talk about benchmarks for success or failure for the New York Jets in 2025. Unlike the last two seasons, the Jets do not have realistic Super Bowl dreams. So we can't judge success or failure based on how far the Jets go in the playoffs. But there are three concrete ways we can say Aaron Glenn and Darren Mougey either succeeded or failed in their first year. One of them will be about simply beating expectations. One of them will be about showing that they can find a hidden gem in the NFL draft. But we're going to start by talking about getting the quarterback right. And we have spent a lot of time over the last couple of months talking about Justin Fields. I'm going to give you a preview. We're going to continue to spend a lot of time in the months to come talking about Justin Fields because he is the starting quarterback for the New York Jets in 2025. And much of the team's success or failure will be based on what Justin Fields is capable of doing. This is a move that I think was intriguing on a number of levels for this team. When the Jets went out and made an aggressive offer to land Justin Fields, they outbid the Pittsburgh Steelers, the team Fields was coming from, to land his services. And I don't know that Fields is really the quarterback of the future for the New York Jets. But what I think he is a time buyer. What do I mean by that? You never want to be in a position where you enter the NFL draft desperately thinking you need to draft a quarterback, because that's when you make a mistake. And the Jets have been there over and over and over. The Jets entered the 2021 NFL draft thinking they desperately needed to pick a quarterback. They took Zach Wilson back in 2018. The entire plan for over a year was that the Jets were definitely drafting a quarterback in 2018. They weren't sure which one, but they were definitely drafting a quarterback in the first round that year. Turned out that was Sam Darnold, who, of course, had a bit of a bounce back year last year with Minnesota, but was not very successful during his time with the Jets. You can go all the way back to 2009, the last time the Jets had to replace a Green Bay Packers quarterback. Brett Favre retired after the 2008 season. Jets were without a quarterback. They had big expectations. They went out, they traded up for Mark Sanchez. Of course, after the Jets traded up for Sanchez, Favre retired and went to Minnesota. But the reason the Jets needed to pick a quarterback was that Favre originally retired. Jets were desperate for a quarterback. They picked Sanchez. In all three cases, these quarterbacks failed with the Jets. Again, Sam Darnold might be rewriting his own career. It's possible, a few years down the line, Zach Wilson could do the same. But ultimately, their time with the Jets was unsuccessful. Now, I'm not saying that the only reason the Jets drafted these quarterbacks was based on need. I think in all of these cases, there were attributes the Jets liked. I think the Jets genuinely believed that all of these quarterbacks could have success with this team. But I think it's indisputable that there was a degree of desperation. The Jets felt like they had to take a quarterback. And that's not the situation you want to find yourself in. Now, I have a very nuanced view of Justin Fields. There are lots of people that think Justin Fields is this hidden, untapped talent that's going to be a star in the league. There are people that think Justin Fields can't play. I mean, I speak with all kinds of Jets fans. I think that in this case, the truth lies, somewhere between these two. I think Justin Fields is a quarterback who has ability. I think Justin Fields has had moments. He's shown that he has potentially the capability of executing in this league. But I think when you get to year 5 and you're at the point Justin Fields is on team number 3, a guy who's had some success but never consistent, it's unlikely Justin Fields is ever going to be a star level quarterback. Is Justin Fields ever going to be the type of quarterback that takes a team to the Super Bowl? I think that that's a lot to ask. And it's not necessarily a huge knock on Justin Fields. There aren't that many quarterbacks who are really capable of that in this league. But what Justin Fields can do is he can keep you from being desperate. And this is why the first criteria for the Jets this year, for me, is Justin Fields entering the 2026 offseason as the undisputed starting quarterback. And what that would mean is that Justin Fields had a very successful 2025 season. And it's possible that the Jets draft a quarterback next year, but that quarterback will be able to come along at his own pace. He won't be thrown into the lineup immediately, because that's what's happened with Jets quarterbacks in the past. The three guys I mentioned, Mark Sanchez, Sam Darnold, Zach Wilson, all drafted in the last decade and a half, all day one starters. The same was true with Geno Smith back in 2013, although there was an injury to Sanchez that factored into that. You want to be in a situation where you can wait for the perfect quarterback prospect to come to you. And, we've seen this in the NFL. The most prevalent example was the Kansas City Chiefs. Kansas City Chiefs owned the number one pick in the 2013 NFL draft when Andy Reid was hired. And there was speculation that they were going to draft a quarterback. There was speculation it could be Geno. There was speculation maybe it was going to be EJ Manuel. Well, what the Chiefs did instead was they traded a couple picks to the San Francisco 49ers for Alex Smith. Alex Smith went on to have 5 successful years with the Chiefs and eventually turned the reins over to Patrick Mahomes. The Chiefs had an opportunity to wait for the right quarterback to fall to them. They weren't that first or second year. They weren't just drafting a quarterback based on need. They waited for the right quarterback to come along. Then they went and made an aggressive trade up to get Mahomes. And not only that, Mahomes did not need to play his rookie season. And, Mahomes is obviously, a future Hall of Famer. Mahomes will go down as one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play in this league. But he also, one of the things that doesn't get talked about is just the situation he landed himself in, where he was on a ready-built roster. He had superstar players across the skill positions. He had the best coach in the league, and he didn't need to play year one. It was a great situation to get himself into. Now, the Jets draft a quarterback a year from now, and they can sit him. That doesn't mean that quarterback's going to turn into Patrick Mahomes, but you want to put that quarterback into as favorable a position as possible. And you also don't want to be in a position where you have to draft somebody, because when you put yourself in a position where you have to draft somebody at a given position, that's where mistakes happen. That's where, that's where you put yourself into a really tough spot. And going a little bit deeper than this, I think that there are a couple of elements to watch with the Justin Fields signing. There's the evaluation and there's the execution. The evaluation, was this the right player for the Jets to bet on? I will tell you, like in an abstract sense, a guy 4 years into the league who's shown ability, a guy with a first-round pedigree, to me on paper, that's the type of guy the Jets should be betting on. That's the type of profile the Jets should be betting on. But the Jets obviously have a scouting department, and their job is to find the right sort of player to sign, the right sort of player who can be a reclamation project, who can go on and have success. And then there's the execution. Can the Jets put Justin Fields into a good situation? Fields is a quarterback with a bit of a unique skill set. A guy who actually genuinely can be an impact runner, a guy you can design a certain portion of your playbook around his running ability. You can put in option plays. It's one thing to be mobile. It's one thing to be able to buy time in the pocket. It's one thing to be able to buy time when you're flushed from the pocket, when you're under pressure. Justin Fields can actually make impact running plays. And if he's going to have success, Tanner Engstrand's going to have to design an offense that's suited to his skill set. So all of this explains why this is critical. All of this, I think it's obvious when the Jets sign a quarterback, his success or failure is important for this year. But if we're trying to get an early gauge on whether Aaron Glenn and Darren Mougey know what they're doing, whether Justin Fields enters the 2026 offseason as the undisputed quarterback, will begin to fill in the details about whether these guys really have a good sense on what they're doing at the most important position on the field. And that's a very important thing to know when we evaluate whether a GM head coach combo is the right duo for your team. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, there's another piece of criteria I have for the Jets. Can they find somebody who can contribute immediately from later in the NFL draft? I'm not even going to specify which player, but this would be a very good sign for the Jets. It would put them in the top third of the league. And I'll explain how I came to that calculation as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. And FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. And, of course, Jets fans, a lot of you are Knicks fans. Knicks just saved their season the other night with a huge win in Game 3 against the Indiana Pacers. Can they even it up? Well, if you think they can, FanDuel's the place to get in on the action. You can also look at over-unders. Jets only 5.5 wins over-under on FanDuel. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. It's going to be a critical way to judge Aaron Glenn and Darren Mougey. Well, no matter how you want to bet, FanDuel is the best place to get in on the action. Are you new to FanDuel? It's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We're talking about concrete ways we can judge whether Aaron Glenn and Darren Mougey's first season is a success for the New York Jets in 2025. The last couple of years for the Jets, we've actually had like a pretty easy way to determine success or failure because heading into the season, we were hoping the Jets would be Super Bowl contenders. Now, unfortunately, in both years, they failed. 1 year in part because of an injury to the quarterback 4 plays in. Last year because the team was just awful and the team made a lot of self-defeating decisions. But starting this year, things are a little bit more nuanced because nobody's really expecting the Jets to be a Super Bowl team. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who thinks that they're going to break their 14-year playoff drought heading into the season. And, of course, it's year 1 of Aaron Glenn and Darren Mougey's regime. So expectations are a little bit low. I think for a first-year head coach GM, you can't always judge it. You can't always judge it on how far the team goes in the playoffs. But that's different from saying that there are 0 ways we can judge them. That's different from saying they have a free pass to do whatever they want. There are certain things we have to judge them on. And I'm going to give you one that's, I think, kind of flown under the radar, evaluating past Jets GMs, evaluating GMs across the league. Here's what I want Glenn and Mougey to do. I want them to have found one day 1 starter on the final day of the NFL draft. So that's rounds 4 through 7. And of course, there are a number of players the Jets drafted in 2025. You could talk about Arian Smith, who was the wide receiver out of Georgia. I'll be honest with you, I was not a huge fan of that pick. But there are Jets made a number of picks on the final day of the draft. Malachi Moore, safety out of Alabama, Francisco Mauigoa, a linebacker out of Miami, Tyler Barron, a defensive end out of Miami. And I want the Jets to find one starter out of these guys, one immediate starter. It's important to find starters on day 3 of the NFL draft. It's one of those things that people don't put enough stock in, but it is really important because you think about it, this is a league with a salary cap. So there's only so much money you can spend. And in an ideal world, you've got good players who are going to make a lot of money. So that means like somewhere along the way, you have to have starters who aren't making a ton of money. And those are usually guys that come through the NFL draft. But you only get like 1 first-round pick a year, 1 second-round pick, and then a third-round pick. Eventually, if you want to be a good team, you have to have a couple of guys who are starters from day 3 of the draft. And I decided to take a look across the league last year and try to figure out how many immediate starters came from day 3 of the NFL draft. There were only 10 across the entire league. Only 10 guys who started at least half the games. And I looked a little bit deeper because, sometimes a guy's not a starter, but he's like a key player on your team. Still only 10 guys played 50% of their snaps or more for their team last year. So, you break that down across the league. So there are 32 teams, so only 10 guys. That means if you can find one of those players, you're kind of in like the top third of the league because 10 players, 32 teams. And isn't that like the whole point? I think sometimes I'll compare the Jets to a team like Baltimore or a team like Kansas City, and people will say, well, you can't compare the Jets to them. They're one of the elite teams in the league. So that's kind of like the curve I'm grading on. People say, well, isn't that what we want the Jets to be? Isn't that the reason we hired Glenn and Mougey? Don't we want them to put the Jets on that level? So I think it's fair to like ask for these guys to find an immediate starter at round 4 or later. There are lots of reasons Joe Douglas failed as Jets general manager. And we can go down the list. You can talk his propensity for valuing physical traits over fundamentals. We can talk about how he and Robert Saleh never really got on the same page or never really developed a philosophy for the offensive side of the ball. Salary cap management, which was really not very good. But day 3 of the draft was rough on Joe Douglas. Douglas was okay, like round 1. Early in the draft, Douglas actually had some pretty good hits. and especially in that 2022 draft. But day 3 was not good. In Joe Douglas's tenure, he really only found 2 guys who were good starters on day 3 of the draft. One was Michael Carter II, and one was Jamie Sherwood. But, you also have to factor in how long these guys produced on their rookie contracts. Sherwood was really only a good starter the last year, and that's, of course, valuable. Sherwood ended up being voted MVP by his teammates, filling in for C.J. Mosley at the linebacker position last year, and that matters. But he was only a plus starter. He was only a good starter for 1 year. Aside from that, he was a depth player and a backup. So 3 years of being a depth player backup, 1 year being a plus starter. Michael Carter II was the only plus starter for multiple years that Joe Douglas drafted on day 3. There were some guys who were decent backups. Brandon Eccles was an okay backup. Bryce Hall was passable at points. Michael Carter, Michael Carter the first, the running back out of North Carolina, not to be confused with the slot corner out of Duke. Michael Carter the first was, he actually had a decent rookie season, but there's really only like one multi-year starter the Jets got on a rookie contract under Joe Douglas. Again, that's Michael Carter II. So it's important to find these guys. And, the Jets have an easy path at some of these positions for these guys to make an impact. Now, Noah, the linebacker out of Miami, he may have a tough time finding a role because the Jets do have Sherwood and they have Quincy Williams. Both of them are making quite a bit of money. Those are your 2 starting linebackers. But as wide receiver room's not that great. There's an opening for Arian Smith to prove me wrong. At safety, Tony Adams is standing between Malachi Moore and a starting job. Can Moore beat out Tony Adams? That's not a huge hurdle to climb. And, even the guy that Jets drafted the last pick, Tyler Barron, he's playing defensive end. So, nominally at defensive end, you have Jermaine Johnson, you have Will McDonald, you have 2 good starters there, but the number 3 defensive end spot's open. And the 3rd defensive end can get starter level snaps in today's NFL. Not everybody rotates defensive linemen in and out as frequently as Robert Saleh does, but your starting defensive linemen are still going to need a rest. It's entirely plausible that your 3rd defensive end can see over 50% of the snaps. So I'm not asking for all these guys to hit. If we're going to be realistic, they're not all going to hit. There are going to be some misses. That's the way any draft class is. Show me the greatest draft class in NFL history. I'll show you guys your team missed on, especially later in the later portion of the draft. It's not about like hitting on all your picks. It's not even about hitting on over half your picks. But you have to find good players across the draft, including in the late rounds. And sure, the Brandon Eccleses of the world who are good depth guys, there's value to that. But you also have to find starters. It's something the Jets have not done well enough. And if you look at the Jets roster, it's in a better place than it was when Joe Douglas took over. And that's a reflection mainly on Joe Douglas hitting in the first round and then Breece Hall in the second round. Joe Douglas did some good things, but Joe Douglas didn't get the team all the way there. And part of the reason Joe Douglas didn't get the team all the way there was because he wasn't good enough in the later rounds of the draft. So that's something that's got to improve. And it'll be our first chance to see whether Darren Mougey and Aaron Glenn have a little bit better luck there this year. Not asking for all 4 of them to be starters, not asking for 3 of them to be starters, just 1. Find 1. If you do that, again, only 10 guys out across 32 teams were day 1 starters of rounds 4 and 7 last year. Can the Jets be one of the teams can the Jets be a team that finds one of the 10 this year? You certainly hope so if this new head coach GM combo is as good as advertised. Now, you're on the Locked On Jets podcast. There's one last measure of Aaron Glenn and Darren Mougey that will be critical in 2025. It's the most obvious one. How many games are they going to win? And it may not be entirely about making the playoffs. It's mainly about beating expectations. And we'll go into more detail on that as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. We're talking about expectations for the New York Jets in 2025, in particular, expectations for the new head coach, GM, Aaron Glenn, and Darren Mougey. It's one thing to say the Jets are not Super Bowl contenders. It's one thing to say that you can't judge these guys based on a deep playoff run this year, whether that as the season's as a success or failure ultimately. But there have to be expectations. You can never just give somebody a complete pass for a bad first season. So we're trying to come up with concrete ways we can judge them that are fair. One of the things that drives me crazy is when a team's rebuilding and you hear the comment, it's not about wins and losses. Now, I think it's fair to say, all right, it's not about wins and losses from the standpoint that, we're not going to view the season as a failure. We're not going to view the head coach or GM as a failure if we don't go to the Super Bowl in year one. That's a fair point. It's also fair to say it's not all about wins and losses. But wins and losses are ultimately like what you play for, ultimately what matters. And frequently when people say it's not about wins and losses, they say, well, it's about developing young players. Yeah, the catch, though, is that if young players develop, it leads to wins. These are not two things that are unconnected. They're actually connected quite a bit. When you have young players who succeed, they help you win games. So when people say it's not about wins and losses, okay, I can buy like putting wins and losses into context. I can buy that there are other things of value that can come from a season, but wins and losses ultimately matter. So what should the win total expectation be for the New York Jets? Well, the easiest way to look at that is, look at what the betting markets have right now. Now, I know this not the perfect way to, I know it's not like the ideal, like absolute slam dunk 100% method for doing it, but it's probably like the best way we can judge how good teams are perceived to be. And our partners at FanDuel right now have the Jets at 5.5 wins. So I decided to look back as far as I could go with FanDuel's initial over-under win totals. I found them for the Jets all the way going back to 2018. So that's 7 years worth of data. And only twice have the Jets exceeded their initial FanDuel over-under win total in a season. In 2018, their over-under was 5.5 wins. They only won 4. In 2020, their over-under was 6.5 wins. They only won 2. In 2021, it was 6 wins before the season. They only won 4. In 2023, it was 9.5 wins. They only won 7. In 2024, it was 9.5 wins. They only won 5. There were only 2 seasons in the last 7 years where the Jets exceeded their initial FanDuel over-under win total. One was 2019. One was 2022. In 2022, the over-under was 5.5. They won 7. 2019, though, I think you have to put an asterisk next to. In 2019, the Jets' initial over-under from FanDuel was 6.5 wins. They won 7. So I'm putting an asterisk on this one for a couple of reasons. First of all, is that 6.5 wins versus 7, you pretty much met your total. The second reason I'm putting an asterisk next to that is if you remember what happened that season, the Jets won their 7th game, and the 7th win was what pushed them to the over. The 7th win is what led them to beat that 6.5 total. The 7th win came the last week of the season against the Buffalo Bills team that played all of its backups because the Bills had clinched the playoff spots. If the Bills played their starters in that game, they would have run the Jets out of the building, and the Jets would have finished with 6 wins and finished underneath that 6.5 win total. So really, of the last 7 years, only once have the Jets exceeded expectations. It was 2022 when they were expected to win 5.5 games and they won 7. So, this is a team that's frequently underplayed its perceived talent level. Now, you could say 2023, well, we thought we were going to have Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. That's a fair point, but the counter to that is 2024, they won less games with Aaron Rodgers than they did in 2023. So all of this is to say that the Jets have, despite the Jets not having, a ton of talent through the years, they've underperformed what their perceived talent level was heading into the season. And one of the things that like a coaching staff does is it gets a team to overperform. A good coaching staff gets a team to overperform a little bit. A good coaching staff can't take like a 2008 Lions roster or a 2017 Browns roster and turn it into a Super Bowl team. But good coaching can improve you on the margins. It can improve you a little bit. And you think about like last year's Jets team. Jets finished 5-12. That Jets team was 3-7 in one-score games. And it goes back to it shows you that, again, teams play a ton of one-score games in the NFL. And the difference between a 10-7 team and a 7-10 team is not that great. It could be a couple bounces of the ball. And frequently one-score games do come down to luck. They come down to elements that aren't in your control. Some guy on the other team making a superhuman play, bad call, unlucky bounce of the ball. But there are other things that impact close games. I think there were 2 elements that really impacted a lot of Jets' close losses last year. One was just bad coaching, because in a one-score game that comes down to a couple plays, bad coaching has an impact. Another is special teams play. Jets special teams were bad last year. Interesting, because Jets special teams have normally been good. As bad as the Jets have been the last decade and a half, usually they've had good special teams. Last year, their special teams were bad. We know about the issues with Greg Zuerlein. So, if you think like the Jets could fix those 2 issues, they went 3-7 in one-score games last year. let's say they go 500. You improve it to 5-5. That improves the Jets' record to 7-10, which is probably like closer to the team's actual talent level last year. I think looking back, we overrated the talent level going into the season. It wasn't really a Super Bowl contender, but it probably didn't. They didn't have the talent of a 5-win team. They probably were closer to like a 7-8 win team. The issue was they went 3-7 in one-score games, and a lot of that went back to special teams and coaching. Well, coaching matters, and hopefully the coaching turns some of those losses into wins this year. And that's why I think it's a critical thing for Aaron Glenn, beyond the obvious point that you're ultimately in the long run judged on wins and losses. In this league, you take the field to try and win games. Former Jets coach had a very famous saying: "You play to win the game," and that's ultimately what the Jets are going to be looking to do. And you can't really say that like your first year is a success if you only win 4 games. Look, I'm not saying the Jets necessarily need to win 11 games for us to look back on Aaron Glenn's first season as a success, but they need to beat expectations. Because ultimately, you should start being judged as a coach immediately once you take over. It's one thing to say like the Jets may have a tough time making the playoffs this year. It's another to say that not all seasons where you miss the playoffs are equal. A Jets team that's competitive and is in the playoff mix until December is very different from an uncompetitive Jets team that's out of the playoffs by October, especially in year one of a new regime. And ultimately, it always comes back to wins and losses. So 5.5 wins. Jets need to beat that. I don't even think 6 would be a major success. I think under 5.5 would be a failure. Let's improve the win total. Let's get the win total up this year. Ultimately, again, if you want to be called a good coach, the best way to the way you become a good coach is to win games. So that's what it sounds obvious, but sometimes we overlook it. Sometimes we get obsessed in the first year by saying it's not about wins and losses. It's always about wins and losses to a degree. And it will be for Aaron Glenn and Darren Mougey this year. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button or you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody, and send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we will have our weekly mailbag. Can't wait to answer your questions.